Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Katherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues brings expert guests to the airwaves to talk through your divorce questions and fill in the gray areas about separating. From thinking about divorce to how to behave during divorce to what to do after, this is Divorce Dialogue. Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Katherine Miller. I'm the founder of the Miller Law Group and a trainer at the Center for Understanding in Conflict, and I am on a mission to change how people divorce and help them divorce with dignity. And I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Gold Buscho to the show today. Dr. Buscho is a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in family issues of divorce, loss, and transition. She is currently attempting to retire, and we're doing our best to keep her from doing that today. She's also a co-founder of a residential treatment program for traumatized emergency responders and their families, where she volunteers regularly. And she has written a book on bird nesting, The Parent's Guide to Bird Nesting, a child-centered solution to co-parenting during separation and divorce. And that book was published by Simon & Schuster in September of 2020. Dr. Gold Buscho, welcome to Divorce Dialogues.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
For the listeners who might not know what nesting or bird nesting is, would you just maybe describe that, what that looks like and who it works for?
Sure. Bird nesting is a term used when the decision is made by separating parents to keep the children in the family home while the parents take turns being on duty with them in the home. In other words, the parents are like the birds flying in and out of the nest while the babies are safe and secure inside their nest. It's usually a temporary arrangement, but it can be long-term. But the key is that it keeps the children stable, it keeps their routines consistent, there's a lot less upheaval and chaos for the children. It's a very child-centered approach to separation and divorce.
So just to be really clear, in a nesting or bird nesting situation, the children stay put in the family home and the parents go back and forth between that home and a secondary residence, whether or not that's one that they share together or that they have separately, or it's their couch surfing or staying in a hotel, but that's what that means.
That's right. There are a lot of different ways to make it work, depending on people's finances and their ability to get along with each other and what their other resources are in terms of family and friends and support network in the area. There are a lot of ways the parents can support their own living arrangements. And while they're moving in and out of the home, they're also developing that experience that will give them some empathy should the children have to do that at some point in the future, for example, when they decide to end the bird nesting.
Yeah, so Dr. Buscho, you said that sometimes people do this temporarily. So I think, and in my experience, people do that, say, all right, we're going to do that for a year while we figure out the separation, we figure out the divorce, and we figure out all those things, and then we're going to end it. So I think what you're saying is that, well, let me just tell you a story. I had a client a number of years ago, and they had children who were really older teenagers, like about to fly the nest, so to speak, and go to college. And I remember talking to, and they had agreed that they were going to do this nesting arrangement in the family home for 2 or 3 years. And a year later or so, I was talking to my client. I happen to represent the mother, but it doesn't matter. And she said, I hate this nesting thing. It's so awful going in and out of the house and all that. And I said to her, well, there's a place in the agreement where you can end it. She goes, oh, no. I much prefer that we deal with the disruption of going back and forth and the children do that. And so I think you're talking about that.
Yes, I interviewed a family for my book, and one of the children who were now adults said that what they appreciated about their parents' divorce was that even though divorce is never fun for children, they appreciated that their parents bore the burden of the divorce by doing the nesting. And this is a family that nested for 6.5 years. But people will nest for even a short period of time, a month or two, while they get their legs under them. Perhaps they'll nest until the family home is sold. They might nest till the end of the school year, or they might nest until the kids are out of school, or until they have another significant relationship that is calling to them that they want to change their living arrangements in order to pursue this new relationship. But even if they only nest for a short time, I always want to emphasize that a month gives a softer startup to the divorce for children. So parents shouldn't feel that if they only nest for a short time, that there's somehow there's a failure there. Even a short-term nesting is going to benefit the children.
What made you write a book about nesting?
Well, so I nested when I got divorced back in the early 90s. I had no clue what nesting was. We did it just because we wanted to keep our kids stable. We had, there was nobody to guide us or let us know how to do it. So we figured it out as we went, and we nested for 15 months. At that time, I had a rented room in a house with a bunch of other people, and my soon-to-be ex had a new relationship, and he stayed with her when he was off duty. I wrote a blog about it in years later, and then Simon and Schuster came to me and asked me to write a guide. I had been coaching people for years because I really do see nesting as so much better for the kids. And so Simon and Schuster came and asked me to write a guide for parents who were interested in nesting because they saw it as an emerging trend. And that was in about 2017 or 18. And then the book came out in 2020.
All right, well, that's interesting. I think it's always great that you have personal, not just professional experience with it. And that I'll bet you gives you a lot of insights into the ups and downs, ins and outs of it, and so I always say to people that I think you really want to have some rules of the road. Like one thing that would drive me nuts if I were doing it is if I got to the house and every single time there was a dishwasher full of clean dishes or a sink full of dirty dishes or an empty refrigerator, no milk for my coffee. Like these are things that would drive me nuts. But you, Dr. Buscho, you lived it and you're a professional. So what do you think about those rules of the road?
I think it's incredibly important to have written agreements. And that's really kind of the core of my advice in the book. And there's some templates in the book to help people draft these agreements. There has to be agreements about the things that I can predict and anybody who's nested can predict would go wrong. And you've named several of them: coming home to a sink full of dishes, coming home to a dirty house, coming home to kind of no staples in the house or dirty laundry. Or another big one is bringing dates to the home when the children are there. I think it's important to anticipate the ways in which the nesting can kind of implode and have pre-agreed upon rules about those things. And you can't possibly predict everything that can go wrong, but you can predict a lot. And you can also predict a way to deal with a problem that you haven't predicted. In other words, something comes up that you haven't actually worked out an agreement around, but you've agreed that when this comes up, you'll sit down and talk it through. You'll get maybe a parenting coach or a therapist to assist in that conversation if necessary, in order to develop a new agreement around that. And also agreements about when the nesting will end and how it will end. I think there are so many important parenting agreements and nesting agreements about the children and about the house that you can document in advance that will kind of ensure an easier time.
Yeah, as you were talking before, I made a few notes to myself about things that could go wrong and things that could be on people's minds, right? Because I think that a lot of times when people are getting divorced, and I completely don't blame them for this, the concern about, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if the other thing happens? And it can be like, your head is exploding with worries about something that might happen, but also might not happen in the future. And so, time, it can feel like, wait a second, I've got to share a place with my ex-spouse for 8 years, 10 years. Like that seems like no fun, so what if I have a new relationship and he's not bringing his girlfriend here? That's for darn sure. What about paying for things? What if we need a new roof or a boiler, and I make more money, he makes more money, whatever, those things. And so what are some of the things that you think people should really think about ahead of time and sort through, and how should they do that?
Well, aside from what we've already discussed, of course, talking about how the nesting is going to be funded is important. So having a budget and understanding how household bills will be paid, who's in charge of paying them. A lot of nesting families set up a separate account for the nesting for the children, for the expenses for the home. And then they have their own separate accounts for their discretionary money, the money that they might spend on their alternate living sites or what they do when they're off duty. So I think having a clear sense of budget and finances is really important. How people set that up can vary. Sometimes there'll be a credit card that's dedicated just to the nesting. Sometimes they'll set up an account that each parent contributes to based on a proportion of their income or however it would work for their, their income stream. They might just set aside a specific amount of money every month. And so I think the financial piece is important. In terms of new relationships, I always counsel parents not to bring new relationships to the home. People have time when they're off duty to date and explore new relationships. And there's no reason to expose the children to someone new, especially early in the nesting period. I mean, the research says kids need a year or two after the divorce to really recover emotionally from the divorce. And so they're really not ready to accept a new relationship. And it could really destabilize things for the kids as well as for your ex if you bring a new relationship to the home. And one of the stories in my book is about a woman who found a used condom in the house when she came back in. And that pretty much derailed the nesting. So these are things that if they had an agreement ahead of time that said we won't bring dates and new relationships to the home, that could have been avoided.
Yeah.
That was a good one. Yes, that was like, Dr. Buscho, why did you let that happen? So, other agreements might be around chores. Parents have different parenting styles, so some things they may not come to agreement about, for example, chores, but they might agree that the house will be in a certain condition when they come back to the house. I think that's really important, that they'll leave the house in a somewhat neat place. Oh, the other piece is, I think, because as you mentioned, sometimes the idea of sharing a home with someone that you really just don't want to be with anymore, or that you have a lot of great grief and anger about, that's a real challenge. And so I think it's important to establish some kind of private space for each parent at the home so that each parent knows that they have a secure computer, perhaps, or a space where the other parent isn't going to invade their privacy. I think it's not often the case, but sometimes parents can have separate bedrooms, but whether or not that's the case, they need to have separate space in the home where they can keep confidential stuff, papers and so on. There also has to be agreements that things won't be taken out of the home and papers won't be moved, and important papers won't be moved, things that they might need for their divorce process. One of the bad things that happened that that almost derailed my nesting experience was when my ex started to move personal property out of the house. He started packing stuff up and taking it over to his parents. This didn't go over well with me. I wasn't happy about that.
Yeah.
And the lesson I learned from that is to counsel people not to take things out of the home at all, just not to let that happen. So things got lost when we were nesting. Important things got lost that shouldn't have been lost. But this can be prevented with an agreement not to move things from the home.
I'm Katherine Miller, and you're listening to Divorce Dialogues, a podcast dedicated to educating people about divorce related topics so that everyone can divorce with dignity. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to be sure that you don't miss an episode. And I'm talking today with Dr. Ann Buscho about nesting and her book, The Parent's Guide to Bird Nesting, a child-centered solution to co-parenting during separation and divorce. And, Dr. Bushko, I wonder about whether or not nesting is appropriate for everybody.
No, clearly not. I think that where there's unmanaged addiction, mental illness, where there's been abuse, where there's unmanageable conflict, where the communication is so poor that the conflict is not controllable, the parents just need to be fully separated, and children need to be protected from the fallout of those problems. So in that situation, I would counsel people against nesting. However, I have found during COVID, I found that some couples were nesting that really had such different parenting styles that I would call them parallel parenting. They couldn't agree on much of anything, but they did agree to just let each other be during their on-duty time, not to intrude on each other's on-duty time. And so they were able to nest. I don't think it's ideal because parallel parenting isn't ideal, but it did end the conflict between them, and that's better for kids. When the kids are not exposed to their parents in conflict, even if the parents are, if there's a firewall between the parents and they're not cooperating at all.
If you would, for our listeners, talk about what parallel parenting is, just so they understand.
Sure. Yes. So, we talk about co-parenting, and I would say co-parenting and parallel parenting are opposite ends of a continuum. And co-parenting in its sort of purest form would be parents that are working together about almost everything. They have good communication. They involve each other in decisions. They're both involved in their children's lives and school and friends and so on. And they work together very, very well. But you think of it as a continuum, and at the very opposite end of that continuum are the parents who cannot work together at all. They don't communicate well. They feel that the other is an intrusion. Very often one parent will say that the other parent is controlling or intrusive, and they just need a firewall between them. And if that's what it takes to end the conflict between them, it's not a bad way to go from the kid's perspective. Most people fall somewhere in the middle. And usually the parent who kind of is closer to the parallel parenting end of that continuum, that is usually kind of where they both land, because both parents need to kind of find their sweet spot on that continuum where they can work together as much as possible without the communication breaking down and without conflict.
Okay, so parallel parenting is when people really don't communicate a lot in order to minimize conflict, because we all know that the worst thing for kids is constant conflict between parents, whether or not living together, married, or divorced and separated. That conflict between parents is the worst. And so I think what you're saying is that if people really agree to parallel parenting, like on my time, I'm doing it my way, on your time, you're doing it your way, and we're going to agree to really where the kids go to school, who their doctors are. But, other than that, you do you, I'll do me. That even that kind of person, as long as there are some rules of the road for how to use the shared space, that those people can, much to my surprise, actually successfully nest for a period of time.
I did not think so when I wrote the book. But during COVID, I worked with so many parents who basically were forced to nest because they wanted to separate, but they couldn't. And so we worked out nesting arrangements and parallel parenting plans. So yes, they showed me that it is possible. It's not easy. And I don't think that most parents who are at that level of conflict would choose to nest because they really want to get away from each other generally. But if they are totally committed to putting the children first and setting aside their own emotions, then yes, nesting can be a viable option for them.
You're listening to the Divorce Dialogues podcast, and I'm Katherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues has been educating people about divorce and relationship issues for over 10 years, more like 12 at this point. Please subscribe to the podcast and don't forget to check out our previous episodes on the podcast website, divorcedialogues.com. And I'm talking about nesting today with a real expert in the field, Dr. Gold Buscho, and she's written a book about bird nesting or nesting. And Dr. Buscho, where can people find out more information about you, even though you're trying to retire, or about your book, or about nesting in general?
Okay, good. I thank you for asking. The book is available on Amazon and bookshop.org, and it's available online at other online bookstores as well. It's also available on my website, which is drannbuscho.com. It's drannbuscho.com. I also have a blog on Psychology Today that is all about divorce and quite a bit about nesting, but about many other issues about co-parenting and divorce in general. And so I think if you search me on Google, you'll find your way to my blog on Psychology Today.
Oh, great. That's great
At
information.
this point, I have over 3 million reads on there.
Wow, that's a lot of people. And I think that nesting is becoming much more accepted and available and common in our practice, in our business. We see a lot more people doing it, at least for a period of time. And I want to ask you something about finances and nesting. And I'm just curious about your experience, because it can feel like, all right, one of the reasons people choose to do this, in my experience, and I think you said this earlier, is that it can seem less expensive to have one big home, especially if you've got a lot of kids. So you got 3 kids, like that, finding a place where they can each have their own bedroom, or there's enough of a backyard, or whatever it is that you're interested in, that you're going to have 2 places like that in an expensive town, or something like that, can seem really cost prohibitive. And so it can seem like there's going to be a real diminishment of the children's lives if they have to change schools or live in much more cramped quarters and go back and forth. So that's one reason, in my experience, that people do this. And so it can reduce the family's expenses. And sometimes there's a question as to who gets the benefit of that share, of that kind of like maintaining of the economy of scale in some way, right? And I'm wondering, and I find that we have some clients who have conflict around that. And I'm wondering if you have any experience with that, and how you advise people to talk about money when it comes to a nesting situation.
And that's a very good question. And generally, when we get really deep into money, I ask them to talk to a financial specialist, because that's not my strong point. What I do know is that having having a budget is important, and being able to know what they can afford in terms of their nesting arrangement, the primary home, and whatever offsite locations they each parent goes to, or whether they share one. They have to know what they can afford. In terms of, and most of the people that I work are working through a legal divorce process as they're nesting. So the financial questions do get worked out through that legal divorce process. I don't know if I'm actually answering your question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in your experience, because I know you've worked with many people who've nested, I'm just wondering how people find a way to talk about the finances that feels, and I'm going to use the F word here, fair, right? And it doesn't feel like someone is, in a traditional situation, the way that our statutes and our case law is set up, no judge ever, as far as I know, ordered a family to nest.
That's right.
Right. And so if you say, okay, well, child support is supposed to be according to this formula. Yeah, but you're not spending that money on housing. I'm covering a lot of the costs here. So maybe I should get less, I should pay less, or, maybe I shouldn't pay less, because if we blow this up and we decide we're going to stop nesting after a year or 2 years, or because one of us wants to get remarried and our new spouse doesn't think this is such a great deal, then how are we going to change that? And I'm just wondering if you've come up against people having conflicts around the money aspects around nesting, or if it's really just more about the living or together situation.
And I think probably mostly because I'm a psychologist and not a financial specialist, we tend to talk more about the children and how things affect the children and what's realistic in terms of what they can afford and making the nesting work. But in my work, if people really get overly kind of concerned with questions of either the finances or the law, I pass them on to those specialists because I don't want to mislead people. It's just not my expertise.
Good.
I prefer to talk about how can we help the children? How can we make this work for them? The whole purpose of nesting is to reduce the damage that divorces might otherwise cause. So I'm interested in how they co-parent and how they communicate and how they work together to support their children.
So great. Like in our last minute or so, if someone is listening to this and they're thinking, this nesting thing could work for us, what are the ways, other than buying your book, which is obviously a good idea to do, what is the advice that you give to people who are thinking about that as a way to sort of get into the conversation, maybe propose it to their spouse and start thinking through the things they need to think through to make it work?
And I think that's a great question. And in the book, there's actually a questionnaire where people can assess their own ability and readiness to nest. And they could have the conversation about why they think it might be a good idea. How would it help their children? I think a commitment to focusing on the welfare of their children and setting aside their own emotions, that's the basis. That's the starting point. Can we set aside our feelings and focus on how we can make this better for the kids? I think that's the starting point.
Well, Dr. Ann Gold Buscho, thank you so much for being my guest on Divorce Dialogues. It's really been a pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope people will give it a try or at least think about it.
Yeah. Well, it's good to know that having lived it yourself, you're still a fan.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome.
You're listening to Divorce Dialogues, a podcast dedicated to educating people about divorce-related topics so that everyone can divorce with dignity. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to be sure that you don't miss an episode.